The rain had not stopped for 3 days. Thick jungle mud clung to boots, rifles, and skin like a second uniform. The multinational training exercise was supposed to be routine, just another joint operation where elite units compared techniques. But somewhere in the darkness before dawn, something changed. A foreign officer watched through his night scope as a small group of Filipino soldiers moved ahead of the formation. They were soaked, exhausted, and carrying more weight than anyone else. Yet their pace never slowed. He lowered his scope and whispered almost to himself, "How are they still moving like that?" The terrain was brutal. Slopes slick with rain, rivers swollen from the storm, visibility reduced to a few meters. Even seasoned troops from wealthy militaries were beginning to struggle. Some leaned on trees during short pauses. Others adjusted their packs again and again, trying to ease the weight. But the Filipino soldiers stayed quiet and steady. No complaints. No dramatic speeches. Just controlled breathing and careful steps. They looked less like men pushing themselves and more like men who had already accepted hardship as part of life. At one point, a foreign soldier stumbled and nearly fell down a muddy incline. Before anyone else could react, a Filipino corporal grabbed his pack, lifted some of the weight, and kept walking without a word. No attention drawn. No orders given. It was as if the gesture required no explanation. The officer watching that moment would later say it was the first time he realized something was different. Not just in their endurance, but in the way they carried each other through the fight. For decades, military analysts had studied what made elite units effective. Some pointed to expensive equipment, others to advanced simulation facilities or high-tech training grounds. In many cases, those factors did matter. But what the observers were witnessing in that jungle seemed to come from somewhere deeper. These soldiers were not relying on technology to carry them. They were relying on habits formed long before they ever wore a uniform. Many of the Filipino soldiers came from places where daily life already demanded endurance. Long commutes in crowded cities, construction work under blazing heat, fishing boats in unpredictable seas, farms that depended on backbreaking labor. For them, discomfort was not an occasional training condition. It was part of their upbringing. So when military training introduced exhaustion, hunger, or bad weather, it didn't feel entirely foreign. It felt familiar. American instructors who had trained alongside Filipino units often noticed the same pattern. During long-range patrols, Filipino soldiers rarely asked when the next break would come. They focused on the mission and on each other. When others grew frustrated, they stayed quiet. When others slowed down, they adjusted the formation to help them keep up. It wasn't just discipline. It was a collective mindset. One U.S. Marine who participated in joint exercises in Southeast Asia recalled a night march that lasted nearly 14 hours. The humidity was suffocating. The ground was uneven and full of roots. By the 10th hour, most of the unit was visibly exhausted. But the Filipino soldiers at the front kept a steady rhythm, almost like a metronome. Their pace didn't spike or drop. It stayed consistent, step after step, mile after mile. He said what struck him most wasn't their speed. It was their patience. They didn't rush ahead to prove a point. They didn't complain when the group slowed. They just kept moving, carrying their own weight and sometimes a little more. It felt like they were built for that environment, he later said. Like they belonged out there. This reputation didn't appear overnight. It was shaped over decades of real operations. The Philippines is an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands, with terrain that ranges from dense jungles to urban slums, from mountains to coastal mangroves. Soldiers there train in heat, rain, and mud as part of their normal routines. They adapt because the environment leaves them no choice. During counterinsurgency campaigns, Filipino troops often operated in remote areas where supplies were limited and support was far away. They learned to improvise, to stretch rations, to repair gear instead of replacing it. When equipment failed, the mission didn't stop. They adjusted. And over time, that constant need to adapt shaped a unique kind of resilience. Foreign observers began to notice a pattern. Filipino soldiers were not always the most heavily armed or the most technologically equipped. But in long operations, in difficult climates, in situations where plans fell apart, they tended to stay effective longer than expected. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet consistency. One British officer who trained with Filipino units described a jungle survival exercise where soldiers had to navigate without modern equipment. Many participants struggled with the unfamiliar terrain and constant rain. But the Filipino soldiers moved through the forest as if it were a familiar neighborhood. They used natural landmarks, read the flow of water, and chose routes that conserved energy. He said there was a moment when his own team had to stop to recheck their maps. The Filipino unit passed them silently, stepping around roots and rocks with practiced ease. They weren't showing off, he recalled. They just knew how to move through that environment better than anyone else. Part of that ability came from culture. In many Filipino communities, cooperation is deeply ingrained. Families share responsibilities. Neighbors help each other during storms, floods, or shortages. That sense of collective responsibility doesn't disappear when someone joins the military. If anything, it becomes stronger. During training, this often shows up in small moments. A soldier sharing food from his personal stash. Another adjusting a teammate's gear. Someone taking a heavier position in the formation because another man looks tired. None of it is dramatic enough for headlines. But together, those small actions build a unit that refuses to let anyone fall behind. Foreign instructors sometimes describe Filipino soldiers as quiet professionals. They don't boast. They don't demand attention. But when the situation becomes difficult, their presence becomes more noticeable. They're the ones still moving when others slow down. The ones checking on teammates without being told. In amphibious exercises, where units must land on unfamiliar shores and move quickly inland, Filipino soldiers often adapt faster than expected. They're used to coastal environments, to shifting tides, to unpredictable weather. So when plans change mid-operation, they adjust their routes and keep momentum. One Australian officer recalled a joint landing drill where communication lines briefly failed. Several units paused, unsure of the next move. But the Filipino squad continued forward, using hand signals and prearranged cues. They didn't wait for perfect instructions. They relied on training and trust. He later said that moment stuck with him. They didn't panic. They didn't freeze. They just adapted, like it was the most normal thing in the world. For him, that quiet confidence was more intimidating than any display of raw strength. In urban simulations, the same pattern appears. Filipino soldiers often move through tight spaces with calm efficiency. Many grew up in crowded neighborhoods where awareness of surroundings was second nature. Navigating narrow alleys, unpredictable corners, and tight staircases felt familiar rather than overwhelming. During one multinational exercise, a Japanese observer noted how quickly a Filipino unit cleared a simulated building. Their movements were precise, but not mechanical. They adjusted to each room, each angle, each unexpected obstacle. It looked less like a scripted drill and more like instinct. After the exercise, he asked one of the soldiers about his background. The young man said he had spent years working construction in a crowded city before joining the military. Long days under the sun. Heavy loads. Little rest. When asked about the training, he simply shrugged and said, "It feels normal, sir." That answer stayed with the observer. He had spent decades studying advanced military systems around the world. But here was a soldier whose resilience had been shaped not in a simulation center, but in everyday life. It forced him to reconsider what truly built endurance. Over time, stories like these began circulating among Allied forces. Filipino soldiers who carried extra weight without being told. Units that maintained morale after days of exhaustion. Teams that adapted quickly when plans fell apart. None of it sounded dramatic on paper. But together, the pattern was hard to ignore. What made them formidable wasn't just physical toughness. It was their mindset. They treated hardship as part of the mission, not as a problem to complain about. And that mindset spread through the unit, reinforcing trust and cooperation. In joint exercises, other soldiers sometimes admitted they felt more confident when Filipino units were nearby. Not because they were louder or more aggressive, but because they were steady, reliable. The kind of teammates who would still be there when things got difficult. That reputation quietly grew. In conversations between officers, in after-action reports, in training debriefs. Filipino soldiers were described as adaptable, resilient, and deeply loyal to one another. Words like feared didn't always mean terror. Sometimes they meant respect. Feared because they didn't break easily. Feared because they kept moving when conditions became unbearable. Feared because their strength came from something harder to measure than equipment or budgets. It came from experience, from culture, from the simple habit of looking out for the man beside them. Back in that rain-soaked jungle, the foreign officer who had watched them through his scope finally understood what he was seeing. It wasn't just a group of soldiers finishing a march. It was a mindset in motion. A quiet, unspoken agreement that no one would fall behind, no matter how hard the path became. And that was the truth many militaries had come to recognize. Filipino soldiers weren't feared because of advanced weapons or cutting-edge technology. They were respected because of their endurance, their adaptability, and their loyalty to each other. Strength, in their case, was not something issued in a supply crate. It was forged through daily life, through hardship shared, and through the quiet decision to keep moving forward together. And that kind of strength is the kind that leaves a lasting impression on anyone who witnesses it.